related. Now, before we get into tonight's slideshow, I'm going to do a slideshow presentation tonight. But before we get into that, I actually came across this just before I streamed. This is a great video. And this is from one of these leftist Arab American comedians. He's from Minneapolis. And he took the right attitude. I was very impressed about the fact that Tucker Carlson is pro-Palestine. This is a great clip. I think this is tremendous, and it's really related to what we're talking about tonight. And maybe you don't know how this is related, but I'll explain. But this is just a clip of a comedian from Minneapolis, an Arab American, explaining how he feels about Tucker Carlson supporting Palestine.
I thought the biggest voice for Palestine would be Tucker Carlson. What? And it's not even an exaggeration. If you look at the size of his platform and the message he's delivering, he's become the biggest voice advocating for Palestine. Never thought I'd see the day. But my thing on this is let him cook, okay? Let him cook. Because if this is where he is now, who knows where he'll be in 5 years? And don't send me old videos of his being like, but he said this. Like, I know, I was alive. Did you know Tucker Carlson's from San Francisco? Yeah. Can't take the hood out the boy. I knew he'd come around. We saw it with that bow tie. Come on, dude. He's reaching people that none of y'all motherfuckers were ever going to reach. He's reaching people that I would have never reached. He's bringing awareness to a lot of people of the horrors that Israel is committing in Palestine. So you got to give credit where credit's due. You can focus on all the things that you disagree with, but I'm focusing on the great work that he's doing, and don't ruin it for me, okay? I want to be in love with Tucker Carlson, okay? I'm enjoying this moment. I'm in love with this man. When he laughs, I come. I love this man. I'm even laughing at his jokes now. I was listening to his podcast recently. I don't know why, but he made this hilarious joke that I wish I wrote. He was like, people think I'm getting money from Qatar. People are saying I'm getting paid by the Qatari lobby. What would the Qatari lobby be called? AQUAC? AQUAC! Oh my God! That's so fucking genius! I love that joke so much, I'm telling it in my stand-up act via Tucker Carlson. Liberation is a collective effort. Liberation is a collective effort. You don't always agree with the people who are fighting on the liberation front, but once the liberation happens, we can go our separate ways, okay? The band doesn't have to stay together. If you've done a lot for Palestine in the last few decades, you have the right to criticize whoever you want. But if you have not done shit for Palestine and you're trying to tear down Carlson, sit down, shut up, motherfucker, and let me pucker for Tucker, okay?
Yeah, that was great. That was great. And it was so refreshing to see that because part of the reason I'm doing tonight's slideshow is in the name of so-called anti-fascism. The left has become pro-imperialist and invoking anti-fascism and the idea that all conservatives or all Christians are fascists is a way that the left has been suckered into supporting war and also abandoning the struggle for economic justice. What I'm concerned about is I want a government of action that'll fight for working families, and I want win-win cooperation with countries around the world. I see that the only future America is going to have is with the rising new economy in the East, with Russia, with China, with North Korea, with Iran. There's a whole new economy centered around the BRICS. And I want America to be friends with this economy and to trade with it. And I want us to have a government that breaks the power of the big monopolies that are pushing degrowth and trying to grind our country into a low-wage police state. And I want a government that fights for working families and makes America a stronger economic power, a country that has a better life expectancy and living standard for the people, and enables us to trade with countries around the world and have prosperity for mankind. That's what I want. And, it used to be until about the time Trump got elected, that was what it meant to be a leftist. I was out there. I used to work for Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General, and we would protest and say money for jobs and not for war. And we stood with Iran, and we stood with North Korea, and we stood with Cuba, and we stood with Russia and the Ukraine 2014 Euromaidan coup. But when Trump got in, everyone lost their minds. And suddenly, I was not safe. And still to this day, I'm not safe to go to leftist rallies. When I go to leftist pro-Palestine events, I usually get people following me around saying, you're a Nazi, you're a white supremacist. When we had our little workshop in Minneapolis, there were 15 people outside protesting, no fascists in our town. Penny, That was the first event she organized in Minneapolis for CPI, and she couldn't believe it. There were 15 of these crazy teenagers outside calling us fascists. It was wild. So anti-fascism and confusion about what fascism actually means has caused the left to lose its mind. So tonight, I thought I would do an educational PowerPoint, and it would be on this very topic. And I'm basically killing two birds with one stone, if you will. So here's the slideshow for tonight. It's loading. It'll be loaded here in a second. But the slideshow for tonight, there are two closely related topics. So it's called "What Does the Word Fascism Actually Mean?" and "What is Right-Wing Anti-Capitalism?" Now, those might seem like two topics that are not related, but they're closely related. And everyone has gotten very, very confused about what fascism actually means. And on top of that, right-wing anti-capitalism is something that Americans just don't understand. In America, since the end of the Second World War, anti-communism has been a huge part of our national identity. America was against the Soviet Union. America was against the communists. And based on that, Americans have become very, very confused about what a lot of words mean, right? It's just, we know communism is what America's against. And so you get a lot of young woke teenagers that think they're communists because they hate America and they love communism. They don't know anything about economics. They don't know anything. They think they're communists. We get a lot of people who think fascism and communism are the same thing because they're both against America. And the notion that one can be a right-wing anti-capitalist, which many fascists claimed to be, which, we'll get into that later, that's also lost on Americans. Americans think right-wing is free market, left-wing is government control of the economy. That's not necessarily true. And especially if you go to Europe and especially if you go around the world, there are many different conservative critiques of capitalism, and not all of them are fascist either. So we're going to talk about all of this tonight, and it's kind of a broad topic we're going to get into, but it's going to be important because there's so much confusion about this. So here we go. What does the word fascism actually mean, and what is right-wing anti-capitalism? Right? We got to go back to the 1920s and 30s. 1922, Italy was in a shithole after World War I. They were on the winning side of World War I, but their economy was doing pretty bad. And, people were hungry and unemployed, and there were all kinds of strikes and all of that. So there was a military authoritarian dictatorship that was established. And it was led by a guy named Benito Mussolini. And his political party was called the Fascist Party. And so that's where the word fascism actually comes from. And where did he get the name? Well, it was because he was Italian, and he was very proud of his Italian heritage. He said Italy was a country with proud history and proud tradition, and he was very proud of the Roman Empire. And the fasces was the actual symbol of the Roman Empire. This is the fasces, right? It's an axe with a bundle of rods around it. And that was the symbol of the Roman Empire. And it's interesting, that symbol is on the dime. It is in the halls of the US Congress. It is a symbol of the Roman Empire that goes back thousands of years to the time of Christ's persecution and crucifixion. And before that, right? The Roman Empire, the symbol that they used was the fasces. Here's another graphic. In ancient Rome, the fasces was a bundle of wooden rods bound together with red leather. A single stick is easily broken, but together they are extremely strong, and the fasces stands through strength through unity. But another part of the fasces is the axe blade, which symbolized the power of the magistrate, included capital punishment, literally power of life over death. That when you got the death penalty in ancient Rome, only a Roman magistrate could do it. And he would hold the fasces, the authority of the Roman Empire, in his hand when he sentenced you to death. And that the fasces kind of really points to why Rome was originally a republic. Originally, Rome did not have an emperor. It had a hereditary senate and an elected national assembly. But only landowning men could vote. Among the landowners of Rome, you had patricians and plebeians. And the patricians and the plebeians got to vote on the National Assembly. And some of the people who were the biggest landowners, they had a hereditary seat in a Senate. And Rome was ruled by a bicameral legislature. It was the Roman Republic. And why were they a republic? Because Rome had a mighty military. and their mighty military controlled the world, controlled the known world. And they extracted slaves and tribute from around the world. And they had a mighty military. It was a military city state. And then in order to raise a big army, they needed all the landowning men to feel like they had some skin in the game. If there was one king at the top, there was no guarantee that when they divided up the loot from all the people that they'd conquered, and when they divided up the slaves and the land and the produce and the crops that they from all the people they looted, there was no guarantee you'd get your fair share. But if you had an elected government where you, as a landowning male, got to vote, you got a say in how the loot was divided up, that motivated you to fight. And so the symbol, it's like you have a bundle of rods, that's all the people coming together, but it's around an axe, around a symbol of weaponry, a military authority, right? We're going to come together and combine our strength and build a mighty empire. And through that empire, we'll control the trade routes and dominate the world with our mighty empire. And that empire will give a vote to every landowning male, so that way he has some skin in the game. It's not just one guy's one ruling family's business, right? It's the whole nation, all the landowning males of the nation get a share of the loot and get a vote. That's what the symbol of fascism is. And that has very little to do with what fascism actually is, right? That's the Roman Empire. But Mussolini picked it because he was very proud of Italy's history. Italy was not doing too good coming out of World War I, a lot of unemployment, a lot of hunger. And so he set up this authoritarian military government that crushed the Communist Party and the strikes that were going on, and established a military, government and control over the economy. And we now know, it's proven, that Mussolini was funded by the British. The British very much feared that Italy would have a communist revolution in the aftermath of World War I, because there were a lot of communist groups. And Benito Mussolini had originally been a communist, but he had broken with the communists over World War I. He supported World War I. The communists had opposed World War I. And he started his own party that was a breakaway from the Socialist Party of Italy, the Marxists. He started his own party, the Fascist Party, that was supporting World War I. He had a newspaper. He had a group of guys who were his, foot soldiers. They were called the Black Shirts. And they got into fistfights and beat up communists and such. And the British were funding him and supporting him. And after World War I, 1922, he established a military dictatorship. 1933, Germany became an authoritarian dictatorship led by the Nazi Party. The Nazis were a group that there's some similarity that took power in Germany. 1936, Italy, Germany, and Japan aligned together in what was called the anti-Comintern Pact, right? The Comintern was the Communist International. And in Italy, the Communist Party had been outlawed. All the communists had been thrown in prison. In Germany, the Communist Party had been outlawed. All the Communist Party leaders had been thrown in concentration camps. In Japan, the Communist Party had been outlawed, and all the communists had been thrown in prison camps. And Japan was actively trying to take over China and expanding into Manchuria and colonizing the people of Korea. And so they formed the anti-Comintern Pact. That was the alliance between Italy, Germany, and Japan. Our history textbooks generally call it the Axis powers, but it was actually the anti-Comintern Pact. And they said, basically, we need the rest of the world to do what we did and completely crush communism. And Britain and America and France, they haven't done that. They're weak. And we're going to form an alliance of countries that will absolutely crush the communists. That was the basis of their alliance. Now, the ruling class of the United States, Britain, France, and France became heavily divided, because there were some in the American ruling class who wanted to team up with Italy and Japan and Germany and do the same thing and crush the communists. And there were some who wanted to align with the communists and the Soviet Union to defeat Italy, Japan, and Germany. And it was a big divide in America. President Roosevelt, he was on the side of the Soviet Union. He wanted to align with the Soviet Union to defeat the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese. And the Rockefeller family, because they were oil monopolists, in with the British Empire, they had the same thing. They wanted to dominate the international oil markets, and they saw Germany and France, or they saw Germany and Italy and Japan as rivals in dominating the world oil markets. Whereas the National Association of Manufacturers was watching the rise of labor unions, and that was a threat to their profits, and there was all kinds of labor unrest, and they wanted to make a lot of money. selling weaponry. Weapons were really good for industrialists, and they were involved in with the militaries. The idea of having the military rule the country was not so bad. So Henry Ford and the National Association of Manufacturers, they were sympathetic to the Nazis, whereas Roosevelt and the Rockefellers and, various other people in the more liberal wing of the American establishment, they were sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And that was the big divide in the Western world. Some in the Western world wanted to align with the British Empire and the Soviets against fascism. And some in the Western world wanted to align with the fascists against the Soviet Union and against the British Empire. And that's where it gets confusing. And we'll get into the history here, because even though the British ultimately were on the side of America in the Second World War, or on the side of the Soviet Union, Italy, you'd never have had Mussolini if the British hadn't supported him. And the same for Germany. So let's get into the history here. But let's start out with, what does fascism mean? There are generally three Marxist definitions of fascism, and they're all wrong, but they all point to some truth. The most common definition of fascism that you will get from Marxists and leftists comes from the Popular Front era, and later was used by the revisionist communist parties, right? So during the Popular Front years, during the 1930s, Roosevelt was a liberal. He was a Democrat. He passed all kinds of pro-labor reforms. He was on the liberal side of the political spectrum, and he was against fascism. Whereas the Republicans, there were a lot of Republicans that wanted to do business with Hitler, et cetera. And so they were less anti-fascist, you could say. And so the Communist Party launched what was called the Popular Front, and it was an alliance with Roosevelt against Hitler and against fascism. And the Communist Party supported Roosevelt, and they endorsed him in the 1936 presidential election. They didn't officially endorse him. They ran their own candidate, but they told people, don't vote for Earl Browder, vote for Roosevelt. And that was the correct thing to do. It made sense. Roosevelt was passing all kinds of popular labor reforms and encouraging workers to go out on strike and have sit-down strikes. And, the Communist Party functioned as a wing of the Roosevelt movement. And the Roosevelt movement were the liberals. They were the left. So on that basis, the Popular Front made sense. It was a tactic. And they didn't blindly support Roosevelt. For example, Roosevelt presided over Jim Crow segregation. The Communist Party, on the other hand, did everything they could to pass anti-lynching laws. Vito Marcantonio, who was the Communist Party's supporting member of Congress from Harlem, proposed the anti-lynching bill, which the Democrats, Roosevelt's party, voted down. The Communist Party provided defense for the Scottsboro Nine. 9 African-American men accused of rape simply for being in the same train car as a white prostitute, and they were going to get the death penalty. And the Communist Party provided their lawyers with the International Labor Defense. They weren't blind supporters of Roosevelt. They knew the Roosevelt coalition had a lot of problems like Jim Crow, et cetera. However, they were part of the Roosevelt coalition. It was a tactic. However, after the Second World War, you had McCarthyism, and the Communist Party was, heavily crushed, by the FBI, forced into illegality. And after McCarthyism, you then had Khrushchev, who gave his secret speech where he denounced Stalin, and the Soviet leaders denounced Stalin, and there was this big de-Stalinization effort. And coming out of that, the Communist Party of the United States and the communist parties of the world were what you could call revisionist, meaning that they weren't advocating full-on anti-imperialism. They were wanting the United States to go easier on the Soviet Union, and they voted for the Democrats as a way of doing that. The idea was the Democrats will be nicer to the Soviet Union than the Republicans will, so we want the Democrats in office. So the definition of fascist that you get, it's still today the most common definition of fascist you get from leftists, comes from all of this, right? From the Popular Front era, but really from the revisionist communist parties of the Cold War years, which is, fascism is the right wing. If people are conservative and the right wing becomes more authoritarian and stuff, they're fascist, right? And the argument that the Communist Party USA and Democratic Socialists of America and people like that use is they say, well, they would say Reagan is kind of like a fascist. And if Reagan gets reelected, he's going to move us closer toward fascism. So we have to vote for the Democrats. Creeping fascism. was their argument, right? And they said this during the Bush years, right? You know, the Revolutionary Communist Party and the world can't wait. It was drive out the Bush regime. Bush is a fascist, right? This argument that conservatives are fascist. If the conservatives are in power, they'll just get more and more authoritarian and more right wing. And next thing you know, we'll wake up and it's Nazi Germany. Well, there's an element of truth in that. And in the 1930s, yes, it was true. The Republicans were more sympathetic to the Nazis and to the Italian fascists than the Democrats were. And, you know, there was an element, certainly in, you know, kind of like, you know, both Italy and Germany had a right-wing authoritarian, right-wing nationalist, militarist, anti-communist edge to their ideology. But that's not really the essence of what fascism is. So, you know, that's the most common definition of fascism. And that's your typical leftist, you know, Trump is a fascist because he's right-wing, because he's racist, because he's scary. Well, plenty of people have been racist in history, but that's not what fascism is. Plenty of people have been authoritarian in history. That's not what fascism is. Plenty of people have been nationalist in history. That's not what fascism is. But that's the most common thing. Is like fascism is the right wing, right? And, you know, and again, it made sense to say that in the 1930s. It was opportunistic to say that in the Cold War years, and now it's completely out of touch. Now, at the same time that the Popular Front was going on, that the Communist Party was trying to build an alliance with Roosevelt, Leon Trotsky didn't agree with Roosevelt. Leon Trotsky and Stalin had their falling out. Trotsky fled the Soviet Union, and he was building his own brand of communism that was different from Soviet communism. And one thing that Trotsky was doing is Trotsky did not support the Popular Front. He said the Popular Front was a betrayal. Trotsky was most likely being funded by the Nazis, right? And I mean, in some cases, like in Spain, that was blatantly obvious. You know, and there's, you know, examples of like how the, you know, the Nazis admitted they had a Trotskyite radio broadcast that they were sending into the Soviet Union. It's not exactly clear, but Trotsky and his allies, who just like the communists worked in labor unions and all of that, they built their own brand of communism or socialism, but they were against the Soviet Union and they were against the Popular Front. So in order to not have the Popular Front and vote for the Democrats and support Roosevelt, they had to develop their own definition of fascism. And just like the other definition, you know, there's an element of truth in it. Trotsky said fascism is a middle-class radical trend that forms anti-labor militias. So basically, fascism is a radical movement that's not of the working class, but is of the middle class. It's middle-class radicals who form anti-labor militias. And there's an element of truth in that, right? That Mussolini had a lot of middle-class people who supported him. Hitler had a lot of middle-class people who supported them, and Mussolini formed his black shirts that were anti-labor. They were not the government. They were anti-labor street fighters that fought against labor unions, right? So there's some truth in that. Hitler had a lot of middle-class people who supported him, and his, you know, brown shirts, what were they called? The stormtroopers. They were against the labor movement. And, you know, so, you know, it was the middle-class radicals that formed their own anti-labor militias. There's truth in that. But that's not the essence of what it is. There are plenty of anti-labor militias. There are plenty of middle-class radicals. And during the Popular Front years, it must be pointed out, the Communist Party also had a lot of middle-class radicals who supported them, right? The Popular Front meant that they had a lot of people in Hollywood and a lot of people on Broadway and a lot of college professors, a lot of middle-class people who supported them. You know, did they form anti-labor militias? No, but actually during the Second World War, the Communist Party signed a no-strike pledge and was not in favor of strikes because they said everything for victory. So there's an element of truth in that Trotskyite definition of fascism, but that's not the essence of it, right? It's not, yes, fascists come out of middle-class radical trends. Yes, they formed anti-labor militias. But that's not the essence of it. Now, prior to the Popular Front, right, before the Anti-Comintern Pact was signed in 1936, before the Seventh World Congress of the Communist International, in the early 1930s, the Communist Party made a really big point of going after the Social Democratic Party and the Socialist Party, the Social Democrats, and saying that they were the main roadblock to revolution. And they called them social fascists. And in the early 1930s, the literature of the Communist Party basically argued that fascism was an attempt to imitate communism by the capitalists. Basically, if something sounds like communism, but it's not, it's fascist. And there's an element of truth in that too, right? If you look at what at what the Nazis were doing. If you look at what the Italian fascists were doing, they were building a mass movement that talked about tearing down the rich, that talked about fighting for the working man, that was against the Soviet Union. And it looked kind of like communism, except it was against communists. That's true. And that when the fascists took power, they tried to have heavy economic control over the economy. They didn't nationalize anything for the most part, but they had to have heavy economic controls, and they promised to bring stability. So it's kind of like communism, but it's not. And during the early 1930s, the Communist Party spoke of fascism as they talk about social fascism, as fascism is, it's something that sounds like communism, but it's not. And you get that today from a lot of like Maoist kind of people, right? If you're the wrong kind of communist, you must be a fascist, right? If you're, so if you preach communist revolution, but you do it in a way I don't like, you're a fascist, right? And some of these Maoist groups will say things like Bernie Sanders is a fascist. Well, Bernie Sanders is not a fascist. He's a liberal. Right. But, because he sounds kind of like a communist, but he's not. He's a fascist. And of course, CPI. We get targeted with this like you wouldn't believe, because we're not, we wave the American flag at the same time we advocate for a government of working families. We're definitely fascist because we sound like communists, but we're not. So you're fascist. Well, that's not the essence of it. Again, it points to an element of truth. Fascists often do kind of sound like communists, but they definitely aren't. So that's an element of truth. None of these three definitions really get to the essence of what fascism actually is. Fascism is degrowth. Fascism is degrowth. When capitalism is in a long-term economic crisis, the only way out is to destroy the productive forces of society. And fascism is doing that, right? That's the essence of what fascism is. But beyond the three kind of Marxist definitions, right? You get, the revisionist, Popular Front one, you get the Trotskyite one, you get the third period and sectarian one. But then there's also the new left definition of fascism. And this is really pushed hard in the universities. Starting in the 1950s, the CIA funded the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And they started subsidizing leftist magazines, Partisan Review, and Encounter magazine in Britain, and Der Monat. And, there was the authoritarian personality study that, Theodor Adorno was paid by the CIA as a Frankfurt School academic. And he published this book about what fascism is. And it's called The Authoritarian Personality. It's all about how fascism is. Some people believe right and wrong exists. And some people, want to give their lives to join mass movements. And some people are not, a bunch of pessimistic, cynical academics like he is. Some people, have what he calls an authoritarian personality. And they might become Roman Catholic, and they might become a communist, and they might become a fascist, or they might become a social democrat or whatever. But the authoritarian personality, authoritarianism, populism, fascism is an aesthetic. And this is what the CIA funded like crazy. Susan Sontag, she wrote an essay called Fascinating Fascism for the New York Times Review of Books. And she said that fascism, I guess there was this former Nazi filmmaker, what was her name? The former Nazi filmmaker who had made some Nazi films. And after World War II, she did a photo display of different African tribes. She went to Africa and found some kind of indigenous African tribes and did a photo display of them. And according to Susan Sontag, this Leni Riefenstahl's photo display was fascist. And why was it fascist? Well, it glorified strength, and it had a dramaturgy of leader and chorus. And, the people were working together to achieve a goal. Oh my God. And, and all of that was fascist, right? Physical fitness and people working together to achieve a goal, and optimism and hope. It's all fascist, right? And eventually Susan Sontag said, communism is nothing but the most effective form of fascism. Fascism with a human face. I mean, this is ridiculous, but she said that. Susan Sontag, the CIA-funded intellectual, basically said communism and fascism are the same thing, and communism's the most effective form because it seems human, And Hannah Arendt was another one of these CIA-funded intellectuals, worked for Partisan Review magazine, etc. And when Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi war criminal, was abducted from Argentina, brought to Israel, and put on trial for killing Jews and in World War II, and then given the death penalty, which, by the way, was totally not legal in any legitimate way. Israel didn't exist at the time the Holocaust was going on. Eichmann definitely was a Nazi war criminal. He definitely did participate in the Holocaust, but they had absolutely no legal right to do what they did because, a country that doesn't exist is going to enforce its laws retroactively. How does that work, right? But, kind of like Trump kidnapped Nicolas Maduro, and he just said, oh, he may be the leader of a foreign country. We're going to decide that this person we don't like in some other country, we're going to drag him here, to a country, and accuse him of crimes. It's kind of like that, except, a little bit even less legal, as Israel didn't exist at the time that the Holocaust was happening. Adolf Eichmann had been a participant in the Holocaust. He had, killed a bunch of Jews in Nazi Germany. He fled to Argentina. Israel sent their spies to Argentina. They arrested him and they dragged him to Israel, and they put him on trial for crimes that were committed before the state of Israel had ever been created. And they found him guilty, and they hung Adolf Eichmann. And before they hung him, they sent Hannah Arendt, the CIA-funded left-wing academic, to interview him and to sit through his trial. And she wrote a whole book called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And if you read her book, it's all about how it's Eichmann in Jerusalem, a study in the banality of evil. Banality meaning normalness, unimportantness, ununiqueness. And it was all about how Eichmann was just an ordinary man. Before he was a Nazi, he was in the YMCA. He was just an ordinary guy who lived in Germany and happened to join the Nazi party. And what Hannah Arendt is saying is that deep down, ordinary people are Nazis. That's what she's saying, that Eichmann, there's nothing special about this murderous Nazi war criminal. He was an ordinary man. And the CIA-funded definition, which is very similar, the New Left, right? Or, the director of the Congress for Cultural Freedom program was Irving Kristol, who eventually became the father of neoconservatism. Leo Strauss was also advising them. And these are the forces that also are considered the founders of neoconservatism. But the New Left and the neocons both said that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany are the same, and that they're both fascist. And that fascism is just kind of when ordinary people get together and form mass movements, right? And this is a crypto-Zionist message, right? Because Zionism says that Jews are just so special and magical and just amazing, God's chosen people, and that deep down, all non-Jews are just bloodthirsty anti-Semites who want to kill them. And so you have to create this magical special state of Israel to keep them away from the bloodthirsty Gentiles, right? That's what Zionists believe. That's like central to Zionism. Well, the CIA-funded definition is crypto-Zionism. They're not straight up saying it, but, Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem, or her book on totalitarianism, where she says anti-Semitism is an essential part of totalitarianism. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are the same. Adolf Eichmann is just, an ordinary man. Susan Sontag, who says communism and fascism are the same thing, and that all mass movements are fascist, kind of. This is Zionism, right? And it just so happens that, most of the people promoting it happen to be Zionists. Hannah Arendt was a bit critical of Zionism, wrote a very good book about Zionist-Nazi collaboration, to her credit. But Susan Sontag was a Zionist. Irving Kristol was a Zionist. Leo Strauss was a Zionist, and this new left definition of fascism, it's really popular, and this is what ContraPoints puts out. This is what all the breadtube people put out. Fascism is an aesthetic. Fascism is populism, and that there's the Umberto Eco checklist of do they glorify the past? Do they there's this definition of fascism is pure malarkey. And it's brought to you by the CIA. It comes from the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and it is the basis of neoconservatism, right? The neocons are a group of thinkers, former Trotskyites who eventually became conservatives, and their view is that that fascism and communism, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, are the same. That America is the antithesis of both of those systems. That America is great because the intellectuals are not threatened by the masses. That the Nazism and communism are both expressions of out of control democracy, when average people just get so out of control. But in America, we restrain and control the average people, so the smart philosopher kings in the Platonic sense can rule, and that's what we need to spread all over the world. And these dangerous regimes like the Soviet Union or Russia or China or Iran, that's when ordinary people get out of control and start asserting their will, and that's what's got to be opposed. That's neoconservatism. And the neocons and the new left both share the same definition of fascism. And it's this same definition where fascism is just mass movements. Mass movements, mass popular movements are fascist. This is also wrong, right? The actual definition of fascism is rooted in economics. If you read what Marx actually wrote, right? And it infuriates me, but very few people know what Marx actually wrote about economics, right? You listen to Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff, he says that, that fascism, he says that what Marx wrote was that there's the workers who sell their labor power, and there's the capitalists, and it's unfair between the workers and the capitalists. It's not fair. Well, Marx did write that, but he wrote a lot more than that, right? And, if you watch your typical BreadTube podcast, your typical Marxist on YouTube tells you some people own the factory, some people work in the factory, some people have way more money than other people, income inequality. We need to get rid of the income inequality. It's unfair. Well, that's not what Marx wrote about. Marx wrote that capitalism has a problem that no other system has ever had, a problem called overproduction, poverty created by abundance, glut, right? If you go to Springfield, Missouri in America, there's a cave. In that cave, you will find millions and millions of dollars worth of cheese. And why is there a cave in Springfield, Missouri with millions of dollars worth of cheese in it? That's to keep the farms from going out of business, right? The farms produce enough cheese at this point that if it was all on the market, the price of dairy would go down so low that American agribusiness would collapse. And so the American government, through the Department of Agriculture, buys loads and loads of cheese in order to keep the prices high. And there's many other examples of this. I mean, the classic example is the coal miner's riddle. The little boy says to his father, "Why is it so cold?" The father says, "Because I can't afford to buy any coal to heat the stove." And the little boy says to his father, "Why can't you afford to buy any coal to heat the stove?" The father says, "Because I lost my job. I was laid off from my job at the coal mine." And the little boy says, "Why were you laid off from your job at the coal mine?" He says, "Because there is too much coal," right? Overproduction. The fact that there's so much coal causes the coal miner to lose his job. That doesn't make any sense. And that this is a problem that is unique to the capitalist system of production. It never existed. Glut, G-L-U-T, glut. That was not a problem in feudalism. That was not a problem in previous modes of production, right? If people were homeless in feudalism, it's because there wasn't enough housing. People were hungry in hunter-gatherer society because there wasn't enough food to hunt and gather. If people were homeless in slavery, it was because there was a shortage of housing. But capitalism is the first system in history where poverty is created by abundance. The more wealth that is created, the poorer people get. And the easier it gets to produce wealth, the more unstable the economy becomes, right? That technology advancing leads to more and more economic crisis. This is what Marx pointed to, that capitalism has this problem of constantly producing more and as a result causing an economic meltdown, the boom-bust cycle. And that ultimately what needs to happen is society needs to come together and take control of the means of production. The centers of economic power must be centralized and operated on a rational plan. So this problem of poverty amid plenty and poverty created by abundance and technological advancement leading to greater poverty is gotten rid of. And you can just have endless growth. That's what Marx wrote about. This is in the Communist Manifesto. He wrote about this very problem, the unnatural problem of overproduction. Well, starting in the 1800s, it was really in the 1800s. In the 1700s, there was a thinker by the name of Robert Malthus. He was a British economist. And he was basically told to write and explain why the French Revolution was happening. And he wrote an essay called The Principle on Population Growth. And he coined the term overpopulation. And he said that the French Revolution was happening because of overpopulation. And he wasn't exactly wrong. Feudalism as a system is very, very inefficient, right? It's, horse-drawn or cattle, oxen, plowing the fields, right? And it's true that in feudalism, more people arise quicker than the ability to produce wealth. And so he came up with this theory that the French Revolution had happened because there were so many people in France and they weren't producing enough food, which was kind of true. There was an element of truth in that. And so he said overpopulation. He just came up with this idea of overpopulation. That was Robert Malthus. And Robert Malthus was a shitty economist, and Marx critiqued him in his important book, The Theories of Surplus Value. But it was in the 1800s that you had the rise of what they called neo-Malthusianism. And neo-Malthusianism was at the time that capitalism, industrial capitalism, was full-blown. People like the Rockefellers, people like Cecil Rhodes, the colonizer for whom Rhodesia was named. Zimbabwe used to be Rhodesia. Cecil Rhodes and the Rockefellers in America and others, they started talking about neo-Malthusianism. And neo-Malthusianism was a little bit different than what Malthus had actually said. Malthus was explaining the French Revolution. Why did France have this big revolution to overthrow feudalism? He said, overpopulation, which there was an element of truth in that. In the 1800s, the neo-Malthusians emerged, and it was the British Empire mainly, the British royal family and Cecil Rhodes and the Rockefellers and others. They started arguing that the problems of capitalism were caused by overpopulation. There were too many people in the world, and growth was inherently bad. This idea that growth is bad. And they formed the Neo-Malthusian Society, and one of the main things they did is promote birth control. And they started working really, really hard to prevent people from having children because they believed that the problems of capitalism were just because there's too many people in the world. And they started promoting birth control. The Ku Klux Klan in America was started by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, the second incarnation of it, not the one after the Civil War, but the biggest one in American history was in the 1920s. It was started by Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a Malthusian, and he's taught at Yale University, and he was one of these groups, and he wanted to make sure that people didn't have children. And the Ku Klux Klan hated Catholics because Catholics didn't believe in birth control. And the Ku Klux Klan, despite the fact that they were conservative, despite the fact that they were, promoting like they were, Protestant Christian fanatics, they believed in birth control. And the Birth Control League was started. It's now called Planned Parenthood. But it was the Birth Control League, and they found a former communist named Margaret Sanger to be the director of it. And Margaret Sanger wrote a whole book explaining why she no longer believed in Marxism. She believed in neo-Malthusianism, and she was a member of the Neo-Malthusian Society, and the Rockefellers funded her. And Lothrop Stoddard, a Ku Klux Klan member, was on the national board of Planned Parenthood when it started as the Birth Control League. And he was a white supremacist and eugenicist, and they were very, very open about the fact that they wanted to promote birth control because they thought the problems of capitalism are caused by overpopulation. There are too many people, and that basically you need to stop growth. And Marx talked about this in the Communist Manifesto. Marx wrote, "The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development and the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions by which they are fettered. And soon they overcome these fetters and they bring disorder." He's talking about the problem of overproduction, capitalist crisis of overproduction, right? The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of bourgeois property. They become too powerful, right? That capitalism has outstripped the narrow restrictions of the profit system, right? The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And then he goes on, how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of the mass of productive forces, degrowth. On the other, by the conquest of new markets, war, and by paving by more thorough exploitation of the old ones, meaning paying everyone way, way less. And that is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. So basically, when capitalism has a big crisis of overproduction, the only way the capitalists can solve it is by destroying society, destroying the productive forces, and waging war to conquer new markets and making everybody poorer. And that only means that the next crisis that comes along is going to be even worse. That's what Marx explained. That's what fascism is. Fascism is when you have a long-term economic crisis, you need to destroy the productive forces, you need to make everybody poorer, and you need to get ready to have a huge war to conquer new markets. That's what fascism is. Fascism is a natural economic outgrowth of capitalism in decay. It is degrowth. And Rosa Luxemburg, when World War I broke out, she said, this world war is a regression into barbarism. The triumph of imperialism leads to the annihilation of civilization. At first, this happens sporadically for the duration of a modern war, but when the period of unlimited wars begins, it progresses towards its inevitable consequences. The triumph of imperialism and the collapse of all civilization, as in ancient Rome. Depopulation, desolation, degeneration, a great cemetery. And that basically World War I was a horrendous, destructive war. It was rooted in these problems of capitalism. And it was going to become, it's going to get to the point that war has to just be a constant reality to keep the economy going. That's what fascism is. Fascism is capitalism trying to reboot itself with destruction, enforced destruction of the mass of productive forces, the conquest of new markets, and thorough exploitation, making everybody poorer to stabilize the economy. And it becomes more and more necessary as technology advances, and it's to deal with the built-in problems of capitalism. That's what fascism is. Fascism is economic. And we'll talk about how this played out in Nazi Germany. How did the Nazis come to power? Well, in 1919, at the end of World War I, there was a failed revolution, right? This woman I just showed you, Rosa Luxemburg, she led an attempt to have a communist revolution in Germany, and they failed, and she was killed. And Bavaria, a big chunk of Germany, established the Bavarian Soviet Republic, or Red Bavaria, but it was put down. There was a civil war, and it was crushed. And out of the failed revolution at the end of World War I, and out of the crushing of Red Bavaria and all that, you got what was called the Weimar Republic. And from the early 1920s up until the rise of Hitler in 1933, Germany had the Weimar Republic. They had the Weimar Constitution, the Weimar Republic, and it was a disaster. Mass unemployment and mass inflation and a lot of political instability. There were two major leftist parties at the time. The Social Democrats were the biggest political party in Germany. They were the party that had killed Rosa Luxemburg, and they were the party of industrial unionists, people that worked in factories that still had jobs. Keep in mind, they had mass unemployment, but those who were lucky enough to have jobs, they were in a union, and that union was the Social Democrats. And the Social Democrats were very anti-communist, and they said that, that communism is the greatest threat, and the Soviet Union was an evil dictatorship. They were completely anti-communist, but they wanted to gradually move Germany toward, like, quote unquote, democratic socialism through reforms. And then you had the Communist Party, which was the party that was aligned with the Soviet Union, funded by the Soviet Union. And Germany had the biggest communist party outside of the Soviet Union, the biggest communist party in the world. And the communists, they didn't control any industrial unions. They were the unemployed people. And they built the hunger marches and the unemployment councils, and they organized bread riots. And in the neighborhoods where you had thousands and thousands of desperately poor Germans that were desperately unemployed, the communists ran the show, and they had their own militia. It was called the Red Front Fighters League, that carried guns, and they would organize bread riots where they would go and, they would, like, break into stores in the night and steal food and distribute it among hungry people. And, they fought the police. And in 1929, they had what's called Blut May, or the Red May, where they seized a big section of Berlin, Wedding, the district in Berlin. They seized it. And controlled it for like 2 weeks. And there was like an armed battle with the German government. And, the communists were the party of the desperately poor unemployed, and they had a militia and their own armed group. Now, at the time in Germany, there was a minority faction of the German communists that was called the National Bolsheviks. And the National Bolsheviks in Germany, they felt that because Germany had lost all of its colonies at the end of World War I, and because Germany was not allowed to have its own army and was being forced to pay reparations to the countries that won World War I, they felt that the communists in Germany should organize for the national liberation of the German nation. That Germany was now an oppressed nation. It was a colony. and they should fight for the Germans to free themselves from the other imperialist countries as an oppressed nation. That was their argument, and they were voted down. The Communist International rejected that. They said Germany may have been stripped of its colonies, but Germany is still an imperialist country. No, we're not going to have a national liberation movement. And I think that was a big mistake. And if the Germans had fought on the basis of national liberation, history might be a little bit different. There is this myth that you will hear. That is that, well, the communists and the social democrats couldn't get along with each other. And that's how Hitler came to power. That's not true. That is a wild, wild misstatement. The German communists and the German social democrats had literally killed each other. One was the party of the industrial workers. One was the party of the desperately poor and unemployed. And there were many people in both parties that thought maybe a united front against Hitler would be a good thing. But it wasn't going to happen because there was trauma. There were deaths on both sides. German police wearing their Social Democratic Party badges had murdered German communists. German communists had killed many Social Democrats. And these two groups were not going to come together. They hated each other, right? And it was just not going to happen. And, you know, the idea that, oh, it was all Stalin's fault, he wouldn't allow them to come together, that's not true. They just weren't going to come together. There was a river of blood between the two groups, all right? So what happened? Well, as the 1920s went on, the German communists were leading uprisings. There was a lot of unrest. So the British funded various counter gangs to oppose the communists in Germany because they feared that if Russia and Germany came together, they would lose control of the European mainland. That has always been the greatest fear of the British from a geostrategic perspective. The idea of Germany and Russia together, if they come together, the British Empire loses control of the European mainland, right? Russia and Germany together, that would completely change the ballgame. And that's why they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, right? The Nord Stream pipeline was Russia selling natural gas to Germany. And the first thing the United States did when the Ukraine special military operation happened is they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. There's always been a huge fear on the part of the British Empire, of the American imperialists, that someday the Russians and the Germans might come together. And so the British were very afraid, with Germany having all these problems after World War I, all this instability. They were very afraid the communists would take over Germany. Germany would align with the Soviet Union and they'd be fucked. So they funded various right-wing street fighting groups to fight communists. There were many of them. One was called the Black Front. It was led by Gregor Strasser. And there was another group that was led by somebody else. The Nazi Party was one of these street fighting groups that opposed the communists. And they had their own street fighting group. It was called the Stormtroopers. And they went around fighting communists. And the Nazis were just one of these anti-communist groups. Many of these groups came out of what was called the Freikorps. They were free officers, former officers of the German military who really hated communists, formed their own private militias to go out and fight communists. They were called the Freikorps, the free officers. Right? Well, among the various Freikorps fighting groups, one of these groups was the Nazi Party. And they had a very charismatic spokesperson, a guy named Adolf Hitler. And there was another guy who was their head of military operations, who I think, this is hilarious, a guy named Ernst Roehm. I will put him on the screen, this guy. Right? And this guy, Ernst Roehm, was the head of their street fighting group. And Ernst Roehm, I mean, he was a pretty brutal Nazi. I mean, he was the leader of the stormtroopers, Ernst Roehm, but he was openly gay. He was a homosexual, and a lot of gay. And that's one of the weirdest things. There were many, many gay Nazis during the early years of the Nazi Party. And that's one of the weird things. This guy, Ernst Roehm, he was gay. He was a gay Nazi, right? And he was the leader of their street fighting group. And he was the guy who led the stormtroopers that killed all kinds of communists and broke strikes and murdered people and carried out assassinations and all of that. And he was just this gay dude who ran the military thing. Hitler was the leader, was the public spokesperson, the propagandist. And they had this gay guy named Ernst Roehm who led their military street fighting thing. And what's crazy is Ernst Roehm is a Nazi, was a loyal Nazi, but because he was gay and because Hitler eventually killed him, you will find loads and loads of books about him. If you go to, it's bizarre. because he was gay and because Hitler killed him, all kinds of books have been published about Ernst Roehm. Maybe he wasn't so bad deep down. Maybe he was a good guy who just, and it's like, he wasn't a good guy. He was just a Nazi, but I guess because he was gay, but because Hitler killed, it's one of the most bizarre things. But like, there are loads of biographies and books, and there's just like an obsession among historians with Ernst Roehm and trying to make him somehow a good guy. He was not a good guy in any conceivable way. I mean, if you don't like Nazis, Ernst Roehm was Mr. Nazism until Hitler killed him. But that's the way these things go. So, so the Nazis were just a street fighting group, and they recruited a lot of gay people, a lot of homosexuals, because Berlin was the center of the gay movement back then. There was no gay rights movement in the world at that point, but Sigmund Freud, right, was from Austria, and Berlin was kind of the center. It was kind of the gay capital of the world, right? And this is something that, again, doesn't fit the narrative. The Nazis are right wing. Why in the beginning were they so common among gay people? What was going on there? Well, in Berlin, you had the psychoanalytic institutes, and you had all kinds of interest in homosexuality. And the communists generally considered homosexuality to be a mental illness caused by capitalism. They called it bourgeois decadence, etc. But Berlin, because it was a cultural hub in the 1920s, Berlin was kind of, it was a cultural hub. They were making some of the best films ever made. Like, for example, German Expressionism. There's a film called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's about hypnotism. It's great 1920s kind of, thriller film. There was a film called Metropolis, which is a science fiction film about a futuristic world, the workers rising up against the capitalists. It's a very powerful sci-fi movie about a robot, all kinds of stuff. Germany was making some of the best films. Germany was kind of an arts hub, and the nightclubs of Berlin were full of drag queens and gay bars, and there were whole institutes for the study of sexual behavior. There was a big institute that was associated with Sigmund Freud and others that was promoting the idea that homosexuality was a good thing. There was another guy named Wilhelm Reich. Now, this is very interesting. Wilhelm Reich, right? Wilhelm Reich was this guy who was a member of the Communist Party in Germany, but he was also a Freudian psychoanalyst. And he started his own group, and it was a big political group in 1920s Germany. It was called Sexpol. And Sexpol went door to door selling condoms in Germany. And they were most likely funded by the Birth Control League and by the Rockefellers, but they were a member. He was officially affiliated with the Communist Party. It stood for sex politics. It was called Sexpol. And I'll put a picture of Wilhelm Reich on here. But Wilhelm Reich and his followers is kind of a pyramid scheme. They went door to door selling condoms, and door to door selling condoms and books about how to have sex and stuff like that. And they were a big part of politics in pre-World War I, pre-Nazi Germany. Wilhelm Reich and the Sexpol organization. I don't know why it's not letting me put the image of him on there, but Wilhelm Reich. And eventually Wilhelm Reich fled to the United States. He lived in New York City. He set up a commune in Massachusetts. Wild story. But yeah, Wilhelm Reich and Sexpol. So, there was a whole vibrant, very sexual liberal culture in Germany at the time. And a lot of that had to do with Sigmund Freud. Basically what that was about was that in the lead up to World War I, Britain was in what they called the Victorian time, where they were encouraging people not to have sex, not to masturbate. They were harshly outlawing pornography, things like that. So the German imperialists wanted to show that they were not like the British. And so Sigmund Freud, who was a psychoanalyst in Austria, was wildly promoted by the Austrian and German imperialists. And they promoted nudist colonies, and they promoted free love, and they built institutes. And it was part of German imperialism was saying we're the more liberal, modern, culture that is not repressing people's sexuality, whereas the British Empire is all puritanical and conservative. And that was part of that. And so after World War I, Berlin was kind of a hub, and you had Wilhelm Reich, and you had the Institute for the Study of Sexuality, and there was a big homosexual culture. The Soviet Union officially declared that homosexuality was bourgeois decadence. They wanted it legalized. They believed it should be legal. And the Communist Party of Germany wanted homosexuality to be legalized. They didn't think it should be illegal. They didn't think anyone should be put in jail for being gay. But at the same time, they maintained it was mental illness, whereas the Nazi Party did not. The Nazi Party in its early years, before they came to power, they were very pro-gay, and they argued that because ancient Greece had been this mighty civilization of gay warrior men or whatever, they thought that homosexuality was a good thing. It was strong and masculine. They thought women were weak, and they wanted to promote male culture. And so, the Nazis were pretty big among the gay circles in Berlin, and they recruited a lot of people, and they had this anti-communist street fighting group. Well, as Germany got more and more unstable, Adolf Hitler was approached by Hjalmar Schacht. Right? And Hjalmar Schacht was an economist, right? And Hjalmar Schacht was a German banker. And he basically said, look, it's going to be the communists or it's going to be the Nazis. We need to have the Nazis come to power. And Hjalmar Schacht started taking Hitler around to other wealthy people in Germany and saying, we need this guy to run the government. And Hjalmar Schacht started recruiting the German industrialists to support Hitler. And ultimately, there was an election. The Nazis never got a majority, but they got a plurality. And Hitler was appointed chancellor. And eventually, after Hjalmar Schacht convinced all the rich people in Germany to support Hitler, Hitler was able to take power. So what did the Nazis do, economically speaking? Well, this is what they did. They rebooted Germany's economy. And for 5 or 6 years, Germany had a pretty good economy. Hitler promised when he was elected, he said, I will eradicate unemployment in Germany. There was mass unemployment during the Weimar Republic. Hitler got in and he took power. The Reichstag, the German parliament, was lit on fire. They blamed the communists for that. So they outlawed the Communist Party, and all the seats of the Communist Party in the parliament were replaced by Nazis. So the Nazis had an ultra majority, and they were able to overturn the constitution and create a one-party dictatorship. And Hitler said, I am going to eradicate unemployment in Germany. How did he do that? Well, the first thing he did is he restarted military spending. Germany had not been allowed to have its own army after World War I. When Hitler was in power, they pulled out of the Versailles Treaty and they started spending money like crazy on bombs and tanks and weapons. It started rebuilding the army and recruiting people to join the army. Second, they had a concentration camp system. All the leaders of the Communist Party, hundreds of thousands of people, were rounded up and put in concentration camps. And hundreds of thousands of people that were in the Social Democratic Party were rounded up and thrown into concentration camps. And they all were not looking for jobs now, were they? Because they were in a prison camp. And then all kinds of people got hired to be guards in the concentration camps and to build the concentration camps. Plus, what did all the people in the concentration camps do? They were slave laborers, and they went around doing slave labor. Volkswagen was a car company the Nazis created, kind of a state, created corporation that made cars. And a lot of what the concentration camp inmates did is work as car factory workers for free because they were prisoners. And what else did the concentration camp inmates do? They made bombs and tanks and weapons. And all of this eliminated unemployment. They also removed women from industry. They increased the marriage bonus. So if you got married, you got like a check from the government for getting married. And they had a huge public relations campaign arguing that women should not work outside the home. They would have a poster of a German woman. She's taking a job away from a good German man with kids to feed. There's a huge public relations campaign against women working in factories and women having jobs. And so by restarting military spending, by putting a whole bunch of people in the prison camp system and creating a slave labor underclass, by removing women from industry, and also they built these huge highways across Germany, the Autobahns, these huge highways across Germany. By doing that, they eradicated unemployment. There was no unemployment in Nazi Germany. There was universal employment from 1933 to 1938. They had an economic expansion. However, Germany was not getting wealthier, right? Society does not get wealthier when you spend a whole bunch of money on bombs and tanks and weapons. Society does not get wealthier when you take a big chunk of the population and make them slave laborers who work for essentially free, right? That doesn't make society wealthier. Removing women from industry, so all of a sudden, there's no unemployment because all the women are not looking for jobs anymore, does not make society wealthier. right? The Autobahn highways, sure, that, that's infrastructure. You're building highways. Okay, that might make society wealthier. But other than that, these are all degrowth methods, okay? And there were 5 years of economic expansion. And basically what the Nazis did is they created the world's first military industrial complex and the world's first prison industrial complex. And that was degrowth. And with degrowth, Germany overall got poorer. The economy and the ability to produce wealth, the productive capacity of society went down, right? The country overall got poorer, but they moved some stuff around, military spending, mass incarceration, and they got rid of unemployment and they stabilized the economy. And there had been people had been literally starving in the 1930s. And in the early 1930s, in the late 1930s, they were living pretty well. Everyone had a job. And so a lot of people were very, very loyal to the Nazis because of that. They had been starving and poor. Suddenly they had good paying jobs. They felt like the Nazis were good people. And that's how they were able to stay in power, is that people who had been in very, very desperately poor conditions, suddenly they were in very, very good conditions. And that's why people were willing to tolerate, not being able to say what they believed, or else they could be dragged off to concentration camps. It was an authoritarian state with a slave labor underclass, with militarism. There was no free speech, nothing like that. But people's lives went from, very, very bad to suddenly pretty decent. They had good paying jobs. And that's why people were loyal to it. But they didn't actually make Germany wealthier. They just used degrowth methods to stabilize the economy. And that's what fascism is, right? Back to the quote from Marx. How do they get over these crises? Enforced destruction of the massive productive forces, conquest of new markets, thorough exploitation of the old ones, right? So you create a slave labor underclass where people are getting paid to do nothing. You destroy big sections of the economy, right? And eventually what did the Nazis have to do? They had to start conquering different places. Now, Lothrop Stoddard, I mentioned him, right? He was on the board of Planned Parenthood in America. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He was a white supremacist and he was a eugenicist. And the Nazis really liked him. So as World War II was starting, the Nazis arranged for Lothrop Stoddard to go to Nazi Germany. And he went there and he did a study of Nazi Germany, which is actually very good. It's one of the most honest investigations into the Nazi economy and how it worked. And he was a sympathizer. He was a white supremacist and a eugenicist. And he basically went there and was like, what kind of society is Nazi Germany? And he wrote a book called Into the Darkness, Nazi Germany Today, which is all about what Nazi Germany was like right as World War I was starting. It's a very interesting portrait of fascism. And in it, this is what he said. How did the Nazis actually finance their ambitious projects without currency nor price inflation? They did it in a number of ways. Fluid capital was regimented and either invested according to orders or diverted into government loans. Profits were skimmed off by basic taxation. Above all, consumption was kept down and living standards were lowered by what was called a process of reverse inflation. The upshot has been the German people have financed astounding expenditures by literally taking it out of their own hides. So basically, they used the government to make everybody poorer, and as a result, they got rid of inflation. And they took it out of their own hides. And that's basically what they did. They made everybody poorer in order to stabilize the economy. And there's a lot of people who don't believe this every time I bring this up and insist, well, Caleb, no, I know Hitler made Germany strong. And no, he didn't. Germany was already a very, very wealthy country, but its economy was in the shithole. And so he used heavy-handed state control to kind of force everyone to be poorer and make society poorer. And in the process, make sure you had full employment, make sure a lot of people had good paying jobs, stabilize things. And that, in my writing, I talk about this a lot. In my book, Where is America Going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution, I go into great detail about this, right? And that this is a really important thing to understand. Hitler did not make Germany wealthier. He stabilized their economy for 4 or 5 years by essentially making the country poorer. And I get into that in here. And that's what's so relevant in our times. Another good book that goes into great detail about this is called Dialectical Economics by Lyndon LaRouche. There's another good book on this topic, which is called Fascism and Social Revolution by R. Palm Dutt. But yeah, that fascism is degrowth. It is capitalism stabilizing itself in an economic crisis by driving down living standards. Okay. So, you know, the three books I recommend, I mean, obviously the most important book on this is the one I wrote, Where is America Going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution. You know, my own work I would recommend the most. I've got like smaller pamphlet versions of sections of that book. You know, what is Bonapartism? What is a counter gang? But on top of that, there are three books that if you want to understand what fascism actually is, not fascism is right wing, not fascism is ordinary people and populism. If you want to actually understand fascism with a scientific and economic definition, the three books you need to read are, you know, Fascism and Social Revolution by R. Palm Dutt, widely available online. Dialectical Economics by Lynn Marcus, which is harder to get, but it's very, very good. And the other book I would recommend is The Psychology of Reaction by Reuben Osborne, which is also widely available online. And that gets into like the psychology of the Nazi movement, what they're appealing to, but it also just talks a lot about degrowth and economics. So if you want to understand what fascism actually is, those are the three books I would recommend. The most important thing to understand is that there is no fascist ideology. Okay. And this is, you cannot find the essence of what fascism is in terms of ideology. Is fascism nationalist? Sure, but there have been many nationalist movements before. Is fascism racist? Sometimes, but there have been many racists in history that are not fascist, right? You cannot find the essence of fascism in ideology, right? Fascism is a mass movement created in order to enact degrowth economics and stabilize capitalism. The ideology is thrown together based on whatever will work to achieve this aim. They will use whatever in order to convince people to do this. It's when capitalism is in crisis, they build a mass movement to justify heavy-handed degrowth, impoverishment, and war in order to do what they need to do. And they will make up all kinds of crazy shit to get people to do it, right? Fascism draws from many wells, not just the right wing. Italian fascism had elements of socialism. Mussolini had been a Marxist prior to being a fascist. It had elements of anarcho-syndicalism, Italian nationalism, Plato, and Italian futurism. There was a whole school of science fiction artists that were really a big part of fascism, right? Nazism drew heavily from German nationalism and conservatism, but also from socialism and environmentalism. The Nazis were huge environmentalists. We got to protect our German nature, our German forests. They were huge environmentalists, right? Fascism is defined by what it does, not what it says. No, fascism is not about people saying bad things. It's about people doing bad things and creating an authoritarian state in order to make everybody poor. Fascists will often say things that sound good while they're doing those bad things. And there are many people that say bad things that are not fascists, right? And that this hysteria of like somebody said something racist, they're a fascist, or somebody did this, and this sounds kind of like something Hitler did. And that's bullshit. And it's silliness, right? And we need to get over this. Fascism is what you do. It's not what you say. It's not what you believe. And they will throw together anything to justify it, right? It's degrowth economics, an authoritarian state to stabilize capitalism. And they will say whatever they need to say. It doesn't matter. There's no fascist ideology. There's no fascist belief system. It's just stuff they throw together to justify what they need to do. All right. So this is now getting to the second part of the presentation. We're going to talk about what right-wing anti-capitalism is. This is from the Communist Manifesto. The bourgeoisie, wherever it's gotten the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, and idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest and callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation, It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in the place of numberless indefensible charters freedoms has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked upon with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn from the family its sentimental veil and reduced the family to a mere money relation. That's Karl Marx. And what Karl Marx is doing, he's describing how things that are very, very, very important to conservatives are being destroyed by capitalism. And the beginning of the Communist Manifesto is Marx as a radical, as somebody who came out of the left in the French Revolution, praising capitalism. He says it played a very most revolutionary role. And look, all these natural superiors and authoritarian hierarchies that existed in feudalism, stripped away. All of these religious beliefs people used to hold, stripped away. The sentimental veil of the family, stripped away, right? And capitalism is destroying all these things that are very, very important to conservatives. That's in the Communist Manifesto. Marx thinks this is a good thing, but he's talking about how capitalism is tearing apart all the stuff that conservative people want to hold on to. Right-wing anti-capitalism is something we need to understand. There is very little understanding of it in America, and we need to understand it. The third chapter of the Communist Manifesto, right? The Communist Manifesto is 4 chapters long, right? Is 4 chapters long. The beginning let's pull up the 4 chapters of the Communist Manifesto. I don't want to say it wrong. Communist Manifesto. It's not a very long text, but the first 4 chapters of it, right? The first chapter is bourgeois and proletarians. The second chapter is proletarians and communists. And the third chapter is called communist and socialist literature, socialist and communist literature. And the final chapter is called the position of communists in relation to various existing opposition parties. All right, so that's all it is. The entire third chapter of the Communist Manifesto is about right-wing anti-capitalism. And he talks about different forms of conservative anti-capitalism. He talks about feudal socialism. He talks about German true socialism. He talks about conservative socialism. All over Europe at the time, there were many people that were against capitalism because they wanted to preserve religion, the traditional family, people's loyalty to the community, etc. There were all kinds of people that were against capitalism, not because they wanted to be part of the French Revolution and the revolutionary movement, but because they wanted to preserve tradition. And Marx spent a huge amount of time talking about these people because they were a really big trend of conservative anti-capitalists. Friedrich Engels wrote a very important book called Anti-Düring. And Anti-Düring was directed, it was a polemic against Eugen Düring. And Eugen Düring was a German professor who was very popular at the time, who was a socialist, and he opposed capitalism based on the teachings of Friedrich List, the German economist, calling for a harmony of interests. And the book Anti-Düring by Friedrich Engels was eventually turned into a pamphlet called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, which is it's considered one of the most important Marxist texts. It's a very short pamphlet that Friedrich Engels wrote. And that Düring said that he didn't want to struggle between the worker and the capitalist. He wanted the people to come together and build socialism in the interest of the nation, right? And that was Düring, right? And that Marx differentiated himself from the various conservative right-wing anti-capitalists of the time because his belief was that socialism would come into the world on the basis of the labor movement, that the worker, the factory worker, and the factory owner, it was an unequal relationship between them, and that the labor unions were being formed, workers were going out on strike, and that was the basis on which you would have a socialist revolution. It would be the worker and his struggle against the employer. And it would be that conflict, that rebellion of the worker against the employer that would create a socialist society. And that basically the French Revolution, as the struggle of the masses against the aristocracy, the next stage was the struggle of the worker against the new aristocrat, which was the capitalist. And that was how we would get an economy where the means of production were rationally organized and centrally planned, and we would get socialism. And Marx spent his whole career arguing with other socialists and saying, my scientific socialism that is based on class struggle and my philosophy of dialectical materialism is different. And most of the people that Marx was arguing against were what you could call right-wing anti-capitalists or right-wing socialists, people that were against capitalism because they wanted to preserve tradition, because they wanted to preserve the family, because they thought that capitalism was making people too individualist and selfish, and they wanted to appeal to the goodness of the nation, the goodness of the country to create socialism. In America, there was a best-selling novel called Looking Backward, written by Edward Bellamy. Right? Edward Bellamy. Read about Edward Bellamy. He was a science fiction writer. And in the 1890s, he wrote a best-selling book that was like the household book, one of the top-selling books in America. It was a science fiction book about a guy who gets hypnotized and falls asleep. And he wakes up in the year 2000, and America is a socialist paradise. And it's a conservative socialist paradise where women are not allowed to vote, where, Christianity is the state religion, where people are loyal to the nation. And he actually called his movement the nationalist movement. And he didn't believe in class struggle. And he thought that class struggle was a conspiracy by the capitalists to prevent socialism. And if you read Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, it's a very right-wing book. It's not encouraging class struggle. It's calling for socialism on the basis of being Christian and basis of being conservative. It's right-wing anti-capitalism. It was wildly popular in America. And that right-wing anti-capitalism it predates Marxism. Long before Marx, you had right-wing anti-capitalism. And in Europe, there was a lot of right-wing anti-capitalism. Probably the most well-known right-wing anti-capitalist was Oswald Spengler, who wrote The Decline of the West. And it was a best-selling book. It's still widely studied. It's considered one of the most important conservative books in history. And Oswald Spengler, in his book, The Decline of the West, is opposed to capitalism. He doesn't see capitalism and socialism the same way Marx does. He says socialism and capitalism are two sides of the human spirit. That within human beings, we have individualism and greed, that's capitalism, but we also have tradition and loyalty and duty. And that every society has to have a balance between the two. And he argues that the West or Europe is declining because we're too focused on individualism and greed, and we don't have tradition, loyalty, and duty. And he blames the fall of the Roman Empire. He said the Romans weren't traditional and loyal and duteous enough, right? And he has this whole theory of civilizations that go through different stages and all of this. And he argues that the West is falling apart, and he blames capitalism for it. He's not a Marxist, but he blames capitalism for it. And his critique of capitalism is that it makes people not conservative. They're individualists, they're greedy, they're not loyal to the nation, they're not, duty bound, they're not loyal to their family and society. It's a conservative critique of capitalism. There's a guy named Ernst Junger, which is a very interesting character. He was a German military guy who developed his own theory of Prussian socialism, it was called. And it was the idea that, they would build socialism in Germany on the basis of military valor, economic nationalism. And he did not get along with the Nazis. When the Nazis came along, they didn't like him, and he did not like them. Why? He saw them as too populist. The Nazis were building a mass popular movement. And he says that's the problem. People need to obey their leaders. We don't want people building mass movements and demanding things and rising up. We need people to follow orders and obey. And he thought the Nazi movement was too populist. And when World War II happened, he was a leader of the Nazi military. But then a bunch of Nazi generals got together and tried to kill Hitler in 1943. They tried to assassinate Hitler because they wanted a peace treaty to end the war. And they suspected Ernst Junger was involved in it. So he was kicked out of the military. A very strange figure, but he was a right-wing socialist. He was not a Marxist by any means, but he wasn't a Nazi either, because he was too conservative. The Nazis had this populist edge to what they were doing, and he was too conservative. There's another school of thought called Distributism, right? And it's a Roman Catholic economic theory that calls for the state controlling the economy and making sure that there are no big monopolies, making sure that all businesses don't grow beyond a certain like community level, right? Making sure there's no big chain stores. There's just, little community grocery stores, making sure the government has a monopoly on lending money in line with the Catholic teaching on usury, etc. Distributism is a Roman Catholic anti-capitalist theory of having kind of a religious Roman Catholic government control the economy. And it's not Marxist. It's very anti-Marxist. And it's very conservative, but it's not capitalist. It's not free market. It's calling for the, kind of a religious government to control the economy. Fascism, the fascist movements, when they were rising, they emphasized right-wing anti-capitalism, right? The Nazi, what is the Nazi party? Their actual name was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, right? And they said, we're socialists, but we're not communists. Communists are internationalists. They're not loyal to the nation. We're national socialists. We're socialism on the basis of loyalty to the nation, right? In Italy, they called their anti-capitalist ideas corporatism. And the idea was that every company would be managed by the fascist government and by the labor union and by the capitalists. There'd be like a three in one committee that would be formed that would run the corporation, that would include the fascist party and the guy who owned it and a labor union. And they would all be kind of combined in what was called a corporate that ran big companies, right? And and all the 1930s fascists, for the most part, denounced capitalism. You would never know that, right? But it's true, right? And in America, Father Coughlin was the radio priest, one of the biggest Nazi supporters in America, Father Coughlin. He was a Roman Catholic priest in Michigan. And on his show, he ranted and raved against capitalism. And if you listened to Father Coughlin, you can listen, all his radio broadcasts are online. I've listened to many of them. They start out with him ranting against capitalism, how capitalism is cruel and unjust and people are hungry and all of that. But then after he's ranting against capitalism, then he starts in on the communists. And he says, and these communists are atheists and they don't believe in God and they're loyal to the Soviet Union, which is this evil dictatorship. And we got to stop the commies. And basically, it's almost like his message is that the communists are the worst thing about capitalism. Capitalism is so bad, it's produced this evil menace called communists. And we got to do everything we can to crush the communists. And then his sermons always end with, and we need the Bible and we need God and we need, and he tells some Jesus, stories from the New Testament. And that's Father Coughlin, right? And he didn't support capitalism. He was a right-wing anti-capitalist. And this is all important. Now, the Night of the Long Knives was the turning point in Nazi history. July 2nd, 1934, the Nazi Party exterminated the anti-capitalist wing of their party. This guy that I showed you, right? Ernst Roehm, he was killed, right? The big gay Nazi, Ernst Roehm, was executed in the middle of the night. They just basically, Hitler was in power and he had all these crazy street fighting Nazis that were going around, creating chaos. And basically Hitler wanted to stabilize the country. So in the middle of the night, they got Ernst Roehm and they killed him. And it was the Night of the Long Knives. And I think Ernst Roehm, they shot him, but a lot of them, they cut their throats. It was, knives, they cut their throats. And basically they rounded up all the leaders of the Nazi Party who believed in National Socialism and killed them. It was called the Night of the Long Knives. And Gregor Strasser, who had been Hitler's main rival in the Nazi Party, who really emphasized the right-wing anti-capitalism, he was executed on the Night of the Long Knives. Ernst Roehm was executed on the Night of the Long Knives. And they played up that a lot of them were gay, right? It wasn't just Ernst Roehm. A lot of the guys killed on the Night of the Long Knives, the stormtroopers, a lot of them were gay. And so the mainstream media in Nazi Germany really played up, this is disgusting, homosexuality or whatever. Ernst Roehm was shot in the head. A bunch of them got their throats cut, and they exterminated the anti-capitalist wing of the Nazi Party. And that was an important turning point in the Nazi state. They replaced the stormtroopers with the SS, which was like their secret police, right? The stormtroopers were the street fighting fanatical group led by gay people. They killed them all, and they replaced them with this. It was like their own FBI or their own CIA. It was called the SS, which was the secret service or whatever, right? So Otto Strasser, who was the brother of Gregor Strasser, and his brother, Gregor Strasser, was Hitler's main rival in the Nazi Party. He fled to Britain. And Otto Strasser in Britain started doing propaganda broadcasts from Britain, claiming that Hitler had abandoned Nazism and Hitler was a sellout of the Nazi movement, and that he was the true Nazi and that Hitler had betrayed the Nazi principles. And Britain broadcast his messages, and it was effective propaganda. The British also had a lot of anti-Nazi broadcasts, but they did broadcast Otto Strasser, who was like the true Nazi, and that basically Otto Strasser was the Nazi Trotsky, right? That Leon Trotsky, you remember, he was Stalin's rival, and he fled the Soviet Union, and from exile, he said, I'm the true communist, and Stalin's a sellout, and the American government and the Nazis broadcast and amplified that message. Well, the British did the same thing with the Nazis, right? That Otto Strasser had a falling out with Hitler. He fled to Britain, and they broadcast him saying he's the true Nazi. And Hitler sold out being a Nazi. After World War II, Otto Strasser moved back to Germany, and he had his own group called the German Social Union. He was basically an agent of British intelligence within the far right. There was a fear in Britain that the German far right, a lot of like former Nazis might work against them or work with the Soviet Union. So basically Otto Strasser went back to Germany after World War II, set up his own party called the German Social Union that was kind of spying on far right people in Germany for the British secret police, British intelligence. That's Otto Strasser, right? So this right-wing anti-capitalism is a common thing. In America, people think that if you're critical of capitalism, you must be on the left, that all criticism of capitalism is by definition left-wing. That's not true, right? In America, because anti-communism is so much of what the right-wing focuses on, and it attacks the left for being soft on communism, people assume that that's the way it always is. That's not the case. And many things that are important to conservatives, like love of the country, the traditional family, etc., are things that capitalism goes against. Why do you think porn is everywhere these days? Is that because of communists? Is that a communist conspiracy? A lot of dumb right-wing podcasts will tell you that that is the case. Oh, yes, well, it's cultural Marxism. You really think that it's because of the Communist Party? Joe Sims sits there and says, oh, boy, I'm going to make porn go everywhere. That's what I'm going to do. Joe Sims is sitting there conspiring to make porn everywhere. Do you really think that's the case? Of course not. Right? Do you think it's China's fault? Do you think it's North Korea? China and Fidel are sitting there saying, all right, we're going to corrupt the morals of the Americans. We're going to put porn everywhere. Do you think that's what's going on? If you think that, you're stupid, okay? The reason there's porn everywhere is because it makes a lot of fucking money. That's why porn is a big business. It makes a lot of money. And that's capitalism. And if you're a conservative who's very, very opposed to porn, well, you got a little bit of a problem there because you're supposed to worship capitalism, but capitalism is creating lots of pornography now, isn't it? Right? And there's this belief that being a conservative and believing in capitalism and the free market walk hand in hand. It's not true. And Tucker Carlson, I've noticed in some of his broadcasts, has started to hint at this. He said he would ban self-driving cars even if they were more efficient because it would be better for the economy, things like that. So all of this is important. And the reason it's important to understand right-wing anti-capitalism is because Marxism left the West, right? The movement that Karl Marx built was called social democracy, right? At the time of Karl Marx's death, one of Marx's last books, which I do recommend you read, is called Critique of the Goethe Program. And it's one of Marx's most important books. It's where he talks about how the goal of socialism is to create a society of vast abundance, where he talks about how he's not interested in redistribution of income. He wants to change the nature of the means of production, right? It's not about income. It's a really important book, and it's very, very short. It's called Critique of the Goethe Program. It's one of Marx's most important books. I've got it right up here. The Critique of the Goethe Program. And the reason that I'm bringing up Karl Marx's Critique of the Goethe Program, yeah, here it is, the Critique of the Goethe Program. The reason this book is so important, the Critique of the Goethe Program, is because what was the Goethe Program? Why is it called Critique of the Goethe Program? Well, it's because in Goethe, in Germany, a group of socialists were getting together and they formed something called the German Social Democratic Party. which still exists. It's one of the biggest political parties in Germany. And they wrote their program, what they believe. And Karl Marx read it and he said, no, 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 they've got it all wrong. So he wrote this short little book called Critique of the Gotha Program. Well, eventually the German Social Democrats corrected their program and adopted Marx's ideas. And the German Social Democratic Party became one of the biggest political parties in the world. And it still is. I mean, in Germany, it's the largest, it's one of the biggest political parties, the SPD or the SDP or whatever. I forget. It's one of the biggest political parties in Germany. And social democracy as a movement, right? They started calling themselves Social Democrats, the Social Democratic Party, rather than the communists, because communism was associated with anarchism and violence and terrorism. So they wanted to be Social Democrats, meaning that they believed in building a mass labor movement and getting elected to office. Social democracy became a very, very big movement. And social democracy proved itself to be a failure. Social democracy, World War I, they couldn't stop it. And that social democracy, in a lot of ways, proved itself to not be a revolutionary movement. Over the course of a generation, it went from being a revolutionary movement to overthrow capitalism to being a reformist movement to stabilize capitalism. And that the ultimate proof of that was World War I. That all the social democratic parties of Europe said they would never support World War I. And then World War I happened, and they all sold out and supported it. And the German Social Democrats were essential, and the British Labour Party was essential. And you couldn't have had World War I without the Social Democrats. And that the movement Marx started because of imperialism, because of the domination of the world by big banks and corporations in Western countries. Because of that, social democracy became part of imperialism. It was actually made imperialism more efficient. You know, the Social Democrats, for example, in Germany, they demanded public education. Kindergarten, right? Why is it, in America, the first year of school that kids go to is called kindergarten, right? What's Kindergarten from Germany? And why do we call it that? Well, because the first place to have it was in Germany. And it was Social Democrats who were protesting and demanding it. And at first, the capitalists said, no, you don't deserve the right to have your kids go to that. And the workers went out and went on strike and protested. And eventually, the German government was forced to give in and create Kindergarten. But what happened? The Kaiser learned that universal military training of kids in school would make the German Empire and German militarism and German imperialism work more effectively. And so in the public school system that the socialists demanded, you got military training and all of that. National health care, right? The first national health care system in the West was created in Germany. And it was a wing of the German military. It was a healthcare system that was part of the German military. And as Germany was rising, right? Britain, France, America were the dominant imperialists, but Germany and Austria were rising as competitors. Their economy was very, very socialistic. It was imperialist. They're engaging in colonialism and all of that, but there was a lot of social programs, a national healthcare service, kindergarten, etc. And there was a lot of kind of state planning involved, and it made imperialism very, very effective. And that at the time that World War I broke out, Vladimir Lenin declared that the Second International was a stinking corpse. And he said that basically social democracy, the movement that Marx had created, was not a revolutionary movement. It was a movement for making imperialism work more effectively. And that has continued to be the case even more so today. The British Labour Party doesn't even believe in socialism. They got rid of Clause 4 in their constitution. They say socialism just means the economy works good for everybody, right? It used to be that they technically had this thing called Clause 4 that said eventually they want the means of production to be controlled by the worker. They got rid of that. They don't believe that. The British Labour Party now doesn't even really pretend to be a socialist party. It's a liberal party. And the same for the German Social Democrats. They really believe that they want the workers to control the means of production. They want to abolish capitalism. No, it's just, they want healthcare for people and better social programs. And that social democracy, which is what democratic socialists of America is, by the way, social democracy is just a wing of imperialism. AOC is not anti-war or anti-imperialist in any fucking way. She wants money to, send to the Ukrainian Nazis. She wants, she supports the Iron Dome in Israel. She thinks that pro-Palestine protests are anti-Semitic. AOC is imperialism, but she's a member of Democratic Socialists of America. She's a social democrat, right? And then some of the social democrats will be more anti-war. Mamdani here in New York City has been very critical of Israel and stuff. So it's complicated, right? It's complicated, but generally social democracy, which was the movement Karl Marx basically started and wrote Critique of the Goethe Program, it deteriorated into a vehicle of Western imperialism. So Lenin in Russia, who led the Russian Revolution that seized power during World War I, they created a whole new brand of Marxist thought that was originally called Bolshevism and eventually became known as Marxism-Leninism. And Bolshevism was, first of all, they have a highly disciplined party of new type. A party that to be a member of it, you have to give the whole of your life, and on top of that, they believed capitalism had entered a new stage called imperialism, the rule of the world by big banks and corporations. And that in fighting imperialism, nationalism could be a good thing, right? That's what the Bolsheviks believed. Marxists had generally rejected all nationalism. Marx had said no nationalism. Well, Lenin said actually nationalism can be good if you're fighting imperialism. The Bolsheviks took power and they established a government. And after Lenin died, they called their ideology Marxism-Leninism. 1928 was considered to be a big turning point in the history of the Soviet Union and the history of the world, really. That was the year of the 6th World Congress of the Communist International. And that was the year that the Stalinization took place, where Stalin solidified his power. Bukharin, the right opposition, defeated. Trotsky, the left opposition, defeated. And Stalin solidified his power, and Stalin was more conservative. Stalin carried out what they called the thermidor in the family. They started promoting the Soviet family, a mother and a father and kids. Now, the mom was working in a job along with the father, and they built these giant kitchens that actually fast food in America is based on the Soviet kitchens. That existed. But, all the factories, they didn't want women at home, cooking for the family. So the women were in the factory, and then they had fast food where you could pick up your meal on the way home from their collective kitchen, right? And the women served in the military and women voted and all of that. But they glorified the Soviet family, father, mother, and kids. And they actually gave a medal to any woman who had more than 10 children. It was one of the highest medals you could get in the Soviet Union during the Stalin period. To be a mother of the Soviet Union meant you had more than 10 children and you were a great person. You were a hero for the community because you had more than 10 children. Kind of the opposite of Malthusianism. Right? They had the 5-year economic plans where Stalin, they set out, we're going to organize the economy to grow and we're going to have 5-year plans. And they had what was called Stakhanovism, wherever if you worked the hardest, you got a reward. And Stalin, generally what Stalin did was he went from factory to factory to farm, rewarding people for working really hard. And I've met Russians who talk about, my grandfather told me the best day of his life was the day that, Stalin came to his coal mine and gave him a cash bonus and put a medal on him for working so many extra hours. And that a lot of what Stalin did was he went around encouraging people to work. And if you look at during the Cold War, that kind of government, that kind of system where you have a very charismatic leader who's like the face of the nation, Stalin, Mao, Kim Il-sung, Fidel Castro, right? Gaddafi, right? Bashar Assad, right? Saddam Hussein, you have the leader who's the face of the nation. You have the government, nationalizes industries and builds the roads and has 5-year plans to make the country more industrialized and productive, builds power plants, paves roads, creates a modern system. And people get rewarded for how hard they work. And the very charismatic leader of the country goes from factory to factory and farm to farm, giving people rewards for working really, really hard. That was kind of the model of communism during the Cold War years. And it's very conservative. And generally, abortion was illegal in these countries because if women are having abortions, the population's not going to go up. And also homosexuality was considered a disease from capitalism. It was outlawed. People were thrown in jail for being gay. It was considered unacceptable, and they glorified the traditional family. But it was an advance in a way. I mean, the women in the traditional family were working and all of that. Stalin also legalized the Russian Orthodox Church in 1927. It became legal as kind of a state-managed institution. And then during the Second World War, Stalin met with church leaders and allowed the election of a new patriarch. And the Russian Orthodox Church was back in full swing during the Second World War. And during the Second World War, a lot of the movies that they made were very nationalistic. There's a film about Alexander Nevsky. There's another film about Ivan the Terrible by Sergei Eisenstein, and that they were glorifying Great Russia and the tradition of Great Russian civilization. And that you could argue that quote unquote Stalinism, or really existing socialism, in a way, it has elements of what you might call right-wing capitalism, right-wing anti-capitalism, in the sense that, it's critiquing capitalism and it's glorifying the traditional family. It's emphasizing loyalty to the country. You've got a leader who's almost like a king, who goes around encouraging people to work really, really hard, and everyone's pulling together to work really, really hard for the good of the nation. This is kind of conservative. This isn't, workers go out and overthrow their bosses. There's a conservatism to all of this, right? After World War II, communism expanded very greatly, but it expanded a little bit differently. In the countries in Eastern Europe, where the Soviet Union liberated them from the Nazis, they created new governments. These new governments were not called socialist at first. For the first 10, 15 years, they were called people's democracies. And that all the anti-fascist parties were in one. The Korean Workers' Party. Korea was liberated from the Japanese. The northern part of Korea was liberated by Soviet troops. And North Korea was a people's democracy. And originally there were three parties: the Communist Party, the Social Democratic Party, and the Christian Party. All three of those parties had fought against Japan. And Kim Il-sung was not a member of any of them. And eventually they all merged into one party, which is now called the Korean Workers' Party. In China, right, the Communist Party led the bloc of four great classes. It wasn't the workers against the capitalists in China. It was an alliance. And if you look at a Chinese flag, even today, this is what the Chinese flag has on it. Right? Take a look at the Chinese flag. What does the Chinese flag stand for? Right? It's the block of four great classes. Right? My goodness, do I not have a Chinese flag on here? Do I have to download another image of the Chinese flag? All right, hold on. Yeah, I have to get another Chinese flag. Hold on. All right. We'll get a Chinese flag image. Chinese flag. Yeah, the Chinese flag. Okay, the Chinese flag. Hold on. All right, we're going to put a Chinese flag on here. All right. Yeah, the Chinese flag. Okay. So what does the Chinese flag stand for? Well, the big star represents the Communist Party. And the four other stars, they represent the block of four great classes. Right? And it was the workers, the peasants, the urban merchants, and the national capitalists. Four classes coming together for what? For the rebirth of the Chinese nation. Well, that doesn't sound like Marx and the workers struggling against the capitalist, right? That's actually, that's almost like Düring, right? It's socialism for the good of the entire nation. But Leninism said that's fine because you're struggling against the imperialists, right? So you could argue that really existing socialism that came into existence during the Cold War, you could argue that there's elements of right-wing anti-capitalism in it. Now, there are things about it that are definitely not right-wing. For example, empowering national minorities. The Soviet Union worked really, really hard to promote the languages of national minorities, to make sure that every national minority had its own written language. Empowering women, right? Women were in the government. Women were voting. Women were in the military, leaders of the military, right? Communist countries had kind of an obsession with women with guns, right? And promoting women. So that's definitely not conservative. And in the 1960s, the Soviet Union legalized abortion and practiced it very, very liberally. And these countries were very atheistic, right? Generally. Now, Stalin did bring back the Russian Orthodox Church, but generally the state was promoting atheism and viewed religion as subversive. So it's complicated. But there's an element of conservatism in really existing socialism. And you could say that there's elements of what would have been considered right-wing anti-capitalism in Marx's day in really existing socialism. But on top of that, there's another thing to be aware of, which is that in 1949, the CIA launched the Congress for Cultural Freedom, funding Marxist intellectuals and creating the New Left, right? And I talked about that earlier. Hannah Arendt and Susan Sontag and, the New Left that equated the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany, that said that fascism was just deep down in average people, etc. And then in 1956, you had the Hungarian revolt against the Soviet-aligned government. The Soviet Union sent troops to Hungary to put down an uprising led by the CIA and fascist sympathizers, but done in the name of socialism in Hungary. 1968, you had the Prague Spring. The very privileged children of the party bureaucracy in Czechoslovakia rallied around a guy named Dubček. And Dubček said he was for Marxism with a human face, but he was anti-Soviet. He wanted to cut off support to Vietnam, but he was presented as New Left Marxism with a human face. And the Soviet Union sent troops to Czechoslovakia to put down the Prague Spring. Well, 1970s, Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the main Cold War strategists, wrote a book that he spells it all out there. And I've quoted this book many times in my writing. Between Two Ages, America Enters the Technotronic Era, where he argued that the New Left, the hippie counterculture, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War protests in America, he said, this isn't a threat of communist revolution. He said, this is a change in how people relate to authority and tradition based on the accessibility of information. Because you can turn on TV and see events from all over the world, because you can get books and read about different things, the way people relate to religion is changing. The way people relate to their country and to the military is changing. The way people relate to traditional hierarchies is changing. And Brzezinski argued that rather than oppose the New Left, the USA should weaponize the New Left and put the United States at the center of information technology and use the changes that would make in culture. Accessibility of information was changing culture. Use that to bring down the Soviet Union and to, quote, Americanize the world. That's what Brzezinski advocated in his book, America Enters the Technotronic Era. He spells it out. To Americanize the world, we have to be at the center of information technology, and that was his strategy, and weaponize it against what he called institutional Marxism, which was the Soviet government, right? And in 1989, that's exactly what the United States did with the power of mass media and with slick advertising, George Soros, and they overthrew the Eastern Bloc, and eventually they brought down the Soviet Union. And the people marching to bring down the Eastern Bloc, many of them said they didn't want capitalism. They thought they'd be able to keep their free car and keep their free health care and keep their guaranteed job, but also get to listen to rock and roll music and wear blue jeans and shop at Walmart. They thought they'd get all the wonders of American consumerism, all the freedom of the West, but at the same time, they would keep the benefits of having a socialist economic system. Well, that didn't work. And the fall of the Eastern Bloc came with economic demolition, neoliberalism. I mean, it was an economic disaster, mass unemployment, mass hunger, etc. They do polls in all the formerly communist countries, and country after country, people say life was better during the time of the Soviet Union. You'll never hear that in mainstream media, but it's true. Meanwhile, 1993, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin was the president. He was a puppet of the West, and he was wrecking the country economically. So they elected a Duma, a parliament that was against economic austerity and cutting, the economy. And it was the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, and it was the various Russian nationalist groups. Well, Yeltsin dissolved the parliament, and he dissolved the parliament. And after he dissolved the parliament, he said that the parliament was a red-brown alliance, that the communists of Russia and the nationalists were like Nazis. And he justified his crackdown, where they actually fired shells and shot shells at the Russian State Duma, the 1993, constitutional crisis. That's where the term red-brown alliance comes from. And that, what we call woke at this point, right? The word woke, it goes back to, it's a slang term that was used in the Black community for people in the Black community becoming aware of racism and, getting interested in Black revolution. That's not what it means anymore, right? Woke now has taken on a whole new meaning. It's mainly used by white people, and it refers to fanatical anti-Republican liberals, basically. It refers to teenagers with pink hair who scream and yell and think everyone's a transphobe and think everyone's a Nazi, right? Wokeism, this kind of pseudo left politics in America, it comes from three stages. First, you had the new left, that was the CIA manipulation of Western Marxists. The CIA started funding Hannah Arendt and Susan Sontag and pushing Partisan Review magazine and pushing this kind of new brand of leftism that was everywhere as a way to counter Soviet communism. That's how it started. Then they realized that these new leftists, right, the Peace Corps, a lot of them worked in the Peace Corps, a lot of them worked for nonprofits and NGOs, and George Soros was this Hungarian billionaire who was funding all of it. They realized they were very, very useful in helping destabilize communist governments. And that's what there's a whole apparatus created by the US State Department that funds protest movements around the world. And it was created after, the new left, after the rise of the new left. There's a whole wing of, you have the National Endowment for Democracy. There's a whole lot of these NGOs and foundations, Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller think tanks. And there's a whole apparatus to pay people to go around the world and destabilize and protest against governments in the name of feminism, LGBT rights, workers' rights, every left-wing cause you ever heard of. The American government uses it to overthrow and destabilize communist countries. The United Auto Workers Union is subsidized by the CIA, and they have something called the Solidarity Center, which is a building where they disseminate, CIA labor union activists to bring down and destabilize communist countries in the name of funding anti-communist unions, etc. Right? This is part of what they do. And then ultimately, after the 2008 financial crisis, the U.S. economy was in shambles, and the color revolution apparatus was brought home. Obama was somebody from the color revolution apparatus. Barack Obama had been an organizer for Acorn, and he had gone all over the world with the International Business Corporation. And his mother, Ann Dunham, had worked in Indonesia and was, he was connected with all of this. And when Obama came in 2008, riding on a white horse to save us from the financial crisis, he brought with him the color revolution apparatus, Protest Incorporated, right, as a way of trying to, stabilize capitalism and bring in reforms to stabilize capitalism. So basically, what it gets down to is this. The computer revolution and artificial intelligence is making capitalism unsustainable, right? Because of this problem of poverty amid plenty, poverty created by abundance. When you have a huge advance in technology that makes it so it's easier than ever to produce goods, the result is going to be a long-term economic crisis. And the computer revolution is one of the biggest technological advances we've ever seen. And as a result of that, we're going to have a long-term economic crisis. And the only way out for capitalism is degrowth. They need degrowth. However, they don't agree about how to implement the degrowth. And the ruling class are fighting among themselves about who gets degrown, who gets the government contracts, and this is called Bonapartism. When sections of the capitalist class start fighting with other sections and using the government to centralize power and suppress members of their own class. That's the natural result of an economic crisis. And one of the positive aspects of Bonapartism is that when the rich and powerful are fighting among themselves, they recruit working people like us to be their foot soldiers, to fight on one side or another side against the other. And a lot of working people are being activated right now to fight against Trump and oppose Trump. And Trump activated a lot of working people and built QAnon and built, all kinds of protest movements to support him. And that this is how working people get involved in politics, as the ruling class brings them into politics as their foot soldiers. However, in the process, they start doing their own research, to quote Jimmy Dore, doing their own research and learning. And as they learn, they begin to develop their own agenda and to not simply be agents of one section of the ruling class or other. A great example is Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson is a Republican, and he was brought into, the ruling class. He was the host on Fox News because his job was the MAGA wing of the ruling class was fighting against imperialism, was not against imperialism, was fighting against the mainstream, the liberals. And they empowered him. But then Tucker Carlson started doing his own reading. And he started realizing that Israel was no good. And now he's a big supporter of Palestine. And he's a big supporter of Russia. And he's very, very anti-imperialist. Why? He was brought into politics just to be a functionary of one side. But in the process, he did his own research and he became independent. And that's how revolutions happen, is the ruling class are fighting. They bring working people into politics, and working people get politically involved, and they begin to develop their own agenda. And that's what's happening right now. That's the process we're in. We're in a long-term economic crisis of capitalism, and it's leading to working people being brought into politics. And in the process, they are developing their own agenda. What we ultimately need is an anti-monopoly coalition. All the forces in America that oppose the big monopolies that ultimately are pushing a low-wage police state and marching us toward World War III, we need to build something like what they built in China, a block of different classes, an anti-monopoly coalition to break America out of imperialism and have a pro-growth, pro-humanity government. That's what's ultimately needed, and that's what the Center for Political Innovation, my organization, is working to build. We want to build an anti-monopoly coalition of forces that reject degrowth, that want to build a government that invests in people. We have a 4-point economic plan, and the slogan that we have widely used is, we need a government of action to fight for working families, a government of action to fight for working families. And that ultimately, that's what will get us out of this. If we have a government that will break the power of the big monopolies and start investing in working people, that is the answer. And the only way that capitalism can continue is with fascism and war. They need to impoverish working people. They need to beat down China and beat down Russia. They need to create a low-wage police state. But the majority, overwhelmingly, of the American people do not want war. And they do not want a low-wage police state. And that is why we must form a movement to demand a government of action, to stand up for the American people against the big monopolies and build an anti-monopoly coalition and demand a government that invests in people, a pro-growth, anti-monopoly government. That's what we're advocating. Our national convention is coming up in Chicago, August 15th. I hope you will join us. And I hope you found this slideshow to be very enlightening. I hope you enjoyed it.